I'm Martin Hurn, Event Director of Futurebuild, and I firstly just want to say a massive thank you for all attending today. It's been a phenomenal turnout. I hope you've had a chance to look around this quite inspiring showroom, and I must first of all say a massive thank you to The Edge for hosting us today. This showroom really does showcase the future of sustainable construction, and if you want to find out any more information about it, we've got some members of the Edge team here today. Vivian and Felix, and I'm sure they'll be happy to talk to you about it afterwards. But today's event is all about asking the question of what role will specification have in reaching net zero, and how will manufacturers and the supply chain need to evolve to innovate to meet those requirements. And so to help us to explore that key theme, it's great to have such an amazing panel of experts with me today. And each will give their perspective on what the industry needs to do to ensure we meet our net zero goals. So I'm very pleased to welcome, and in no particular order, Dr Gavin Dunn, Dr Oliver Jones, Chaline Church, and Duncan Baker-Brown. But before we dive into the presentations, I wanted to give you some exclusive insights into a piece of research we've recently carried out, and I hope this gives some further context into the discussions that we're going to have today. So we surveyed our 2020 and 2022 visitor registrations. We asked them a series of questions exploring the current barriers to specify new innovations and products, and we had a great response. The survey was completed by just under 350 people, and it was really those right across the built environment. And as you can see here, it very much closely mirrors who our audience is, who comes to Futurebuild year in, year out. And I'm very pleased to say, so does the seniority. So it was those director level that were coming to the show. So we also showed that almost 85% were influencers in that specification of new products and new innovations. But the first question we asked them was, how many new products or innovations have you successfully specified within the last 12 months? And you can see here, almost 38% was zero, and a further 50% was just 1 in 5 new innovations. So I think it shows the challenges that you guys as the supply chain have in influencing those specifiers to change spec. So we dived a bit deeper and asked what drives your need and want to use new products and innovations. And as you can see here, the big search at the moment is for those low carbon net zero materials, and really that's outweighing now the unsatisfaction that people have with existing products and the specific needs and wants of clients and their demands. Looking at the barriers to specify new products and innovations, we found that the top 3 were the resistance to switch from traditional technologies, a perceived higher cost of those green technologies and products, and the risks involved in implementing new technologies. And you can see here there's a whole list of barriers to getting those new products and innovations specified, so it's no easy task. However, our survey showed that the top 3 areas in which our audience were actively looking for new solutions were in renewables, in those low carbon materials, and those net zero solutions. So it's very safe to say that the green agenda is the top of that agenda at the moment. And this closely mirrors the feedback from our 2022 event registration and post-show research too. Both showed that 75% of Futurebuild's audience come to the show purely to source those new innovations and new products and new technologies. So looking forward, we asked the big question of what advances or new technologies are they most excited about? And this is very much an open-ended question, so we've got hundreds of different responses, but we've tried to really group this into 3 main groups. Finally, we asked, which manufacturers and suppliers do you see as the lead of innovative players within the industry? Now, I'm sorry if you're not listed, but I truly think everyone in this room is a leading brand, but this is just what our sample told us. Personally, I'm really passionate about promoting new game-changing innovations, and I see these coming from the SMEs and the startups as well as the key brands. And our role as an event brand is to help amplify your messaging and give you direct access to our specifier community. And actually, that perfectly leads me into introducing our first guest speaker, Dr Gavin Dunn. Gavin is chair for the Future Home Standard. He's the chief executive of CABE, and he recently chaired the Part L review and is chair of the Future Home Standards Working Group. So it's my pleasure to welcome Gavin to the stage.
Thank you, Martin. Hopefully my voice is going to hold up. It's my third day out and about talking to people. So we'll see how it goes. So as Martin said, I'm Dr Gavin Dunn, I'm Chief Executive of CABE. And in particular today, I'll be talking to you from a regulatory and standards point of view, because irrespective of what we all build and procure, and I genuinely believe, so there goes, my voice is going already, that's not a good start, is it? I genuinely believe that procurement is the single way that we can genuinely change and revolutionise the industry. If you think about our procurement contracts in this sector, if a client specifies something, it rolls down the entire supply chain. If you specify a particular product, or from my perspective, a particular standard, everyone falls in line. All of a sudden, the client wants it. It is valued. It's not something we're doing because someone made us do it. It becomes something. So procurement contracts, the way we specify, genuinely have the chance to change things. And from my point of view, there's a real opportunity at the moment to use that approach to get away from, and I'll say it, the culture of our sector at the moment is all too driven by the lowest capital cost, minimum requirements, designing for compliance, all the things that aren't going to get us where it needs to do. The regulatory requirement, the stuff I spend a huge amount of my time doing, even with things like the Future Home Standard and the current changes to Part L and F, these are the minimum acceptable standards. Right? So if you're designing and specifying to meet the minimum, odds are most of the time we won't even get that, and the evidence shows that. So I want to reframe the conversation a little bit, not about lowest capital cost, not about meeting the minimum, but think of it as regulatory standards being the baseline, but then standards. And in this country, in the construction sector, globally, we are great at producing voluntary standards above regulatory. So think about above regulatory standards, minimum compliance. If we can start thinking about using those standards, absolutely we have to talk about and meet the minimum requirements, and government will continue to push and nudge up the minimum. They might actually start requiring some quite strong levels of minimum. But above and beyond that, there's all these not above regulatory, voluntary standards. This sector's awash with them, whether it be several thousand from BSI, construction related, product related, performance related, management of building standards that BSI publishes, or whether it's things like BREEAM, LEED, and all of those sort of things that allow us to specify a higher level of performance across a wider range of requirements. Not just operational energy, but starting to get into those other elements. If we can change that conversation, we can start to drive things forward. So that's what I effectively do. I mean, I often jokingly refer to myself as a recovering architect, but actually these days I'm better described as a chartered building engineer. And what we do as an organisation, what I've spent the last 25 years doing, is working in that space of the applications of regulations and standards in terms of trying to improve better outcomes for the built environment. Now, from my perspective, and my particular area of specialism is about operational energy, carbon performance, and the wider environmental impacts. But increasingly, we're finding ourselves looking at all the wider impacts: social capital, social equality, inclusivity, ecology. All these things are linked, and the potential to add so much more value is huge if we can start building beyond. We all know that if you start building a little bit beyond the minimum requirements, actually the additional capital cost, if you can get someone to pay for it currently, is relatively small, and the paybacks tend to be quite hard. Now, as from a business perspective, if I hear I can add value, most of us are going, oh, if I can add value, we can make more money out of that. And that starts to change business models, and I think other speakers might touch on that. So we've got a great tradition of above regulatory standards in this sector in this country, so the tools are there. Government will start to do its part by raising the minimum and hopefully starting to incentivise some of the wider changes. And I guess that's probably the bit that you guys want me to reflect on the most in terms of that minimum baseline. Because at the moment, that's still the game in town, right? Government requires a minimum, that's what we're all working to. Hopefully that will change. In the meantime, we will continue to raise the minimum standards. So I guess the primary reason I'm here is I've just completed the Future Home Standard work, or phase 1 of the Future Home Standard work. And that's part of the Building Regulations Advisory Committee, which is advisory to government on this. So this is changes to the building regulations. It is resetting the minimum standards for energy use, operational, ventilation, new requirements for overheating, and starting to integrate things like electric car charging infrastructure as well. So it's interesting, isn't it? So if you're looking at this from an environmental perspective, or people like me who have been bought into how do we change the world through a better built environment, we go, well, this is not going anywhere near far enough. If I look at this from a government perspective, or from 7 years I've spent on BRAC, this is the largest regulatory change in 30 years. It's integrated across multiple parts of the regulations. It accepts that if you change one bit of the building regulations, you have to adapt other bits. In other words, it's a very significant step in the right direction, in my opinion. In case you haven't noticed, and a lot of people still haven't, these requirements started to kick in last week, 22nd of June. The first phase of the Future Home Standard became law and became in effect. So if you are starting a new home, or if you're making your application for building regulations as of today, you will be expected to meet these new standards, which are increasingly these days called FLOSS. I don't know where it got from, but it's an acronym of F for ventilation, L for energy, O for overheating, and S. So what are those requirements doing, and where does it go next? So in very simple terms, two major changes to two parts of the building regulations. So that's in terms of a further tightening of the energy performance requirements in Part L, but equivalent to about a 31% increase on higher performance expectation in carbon terms over the 2013 standards, which of course everyone's supposedly building to, as well as further tightening of fabric expectations in terms of fabric performance, in terms of, and a very significant shift actually in terms of starting the journey of changing what energy sources and we use for heating our homes and buildings. For the last 30 odd years, the UK regulations have favoured natural gas, because post-Kyoto 92, it made sense, right? It was relatively cheap, clean, it was relatively cheap, it was very doable. So we spent 30 years encouraging everyone to put gas boilers in. If you look just over the horizon now, guess what? We're not going to be able to use gas anymore because it's not compatible with a zero carbon world. Actually, we can't afford to burn it. We're realising that actually some of it's running out, or we have to import it from places we don't want. Oh, and by the way, it's got flue gas emissions at street level, and if you're in places like London, that's starting to create air quality issues. So it starts the transition of moving to electric homes, which is where we will go be no next. The other major change is in F, and that's about ventilation, and that's accepting that most homes in this country are currently not ventilated to the required minimum standards. It is not a coincidence that we have the highest rate of underlying respiratory ill health in this country and anywhere in the Western world. Our buildings are under-ventilated. So as we continue to tighten the energy requirements, we need to make sure the homes are properly ventilated. And when we go to really high performance from a fabric point of view, ventilation becomes critical to achieving not only your thermal performance, but obviously making sure there's sufficient and appropriate fresh air so that the people in the buildings are healthy. So they're starting to see the integration of fabric, very high levels of fabric performance, into mechanical services requirements as well. Much more of a whole house holistic approach. Other changes for the FLOSS regulations. Also, two entirely new parts of the regulations. Again, law last week. A requirement to assess homes for extreme overheating, So in other words, accepting climate change, accepting we're building buildings that are tighter, and from an energy point of view, we also need to make sure, yes, that they are warm and energy efficient in winter, but we need to make sure that they're not a high likelihood of overheating in summer, to the point where they create ill health. And this is a health and safety standard, not a comfort standard. If you want comfort, you need to look at other things, but just making sure that we're not literally killing some of the most vulnerable people in our society. The numbers are scary. If you take current climate change scenarios and current build types, the evidence suggests that as many as half the homes in this country will be suffering severe overheating by 2050. And the CIBSE UCL data suggests that might result in the hastening of 4,500 deaths per year. In other words, far more people dying as a result of that, potentially, than in fires or structural failure. It just happens slowly. And then the final part of the changes we're seeing at the moment is S, and I'll come back to the theme, which is then actually a building regulatory requirement from another government department, and it's starting to accept that actually provision of electric car charging infrastructure, because everything's going electric, not just our homes, but our transport as well. So that when you're building a new home, isn't it a really good idea the house builder actually puts in an electric car charging if you've got a parking space, so that homeowners can actually get what they need. So, biggest set of changes for 30 years in the building regulations, and the first step, because this is 2020, this is 21 changes, even though they're happening in 2022. 2025, the next step again, and that will be what they're referring to, the Future Home Standard. Government will be consulting on it next year, and that will be effectively very, very high performance homes, about a 75% reduction in carbon compared to 2030 standards. More requirements on ventilation, more requirements on overheating, and in particular starting to address some of the next key challenges as well. The performance gap, ensuring there's much greater attention given to what you're actually designing is actually getting built and put forward in a way that can be used. Parliamentary Select Committee has just also suggested to government that they might wish to include things like whole house, whole life carbon assessments to start to impact the materiality and the life cycle carbon impacts of materials into those regulations as well. I think other people are going to touch on that, but it is the start of the journey. It's only the minimum regulatory requirement. But I tell you, if 2025, there's a minimum requirement from a regulatory perspective comes out and says you have to assess whole life carbon on every new building, that's a very significant step forward. And actually, far, far more progressive and far-reaching than I ever thought was possible even a few years ago. I joined BRAC in 2015. Zero carbon homes had just been scrapped. Everything else seemed to be scrapped. If you were in the energy and environmental game at that time, you thought government was abandoning the agenda. 5 years in the wilderness, and it's all coming back very, very quickly. I genuinely believe, as a sector, we have the ability to do so much better for the people that occupy buildings, but also for the climate. And by the way, I think we can build a more profitable, more valuable, and nicer industry working when we do it. But it requires everyone to actually come together. Government can do its bit, but actually so much more. And if we just do the minimum from government, we won't get there. I think that's plenty for me, and hopefully I've teed up a few other speakers. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, thank you, Gavin. We're going to do questions right at the end for the panel as a whole, so start thinking about some. Next up, if this works, there you go. Next up, very pleased to welcome Dr Oliver Jones, who's the Research Director at Ryder Architecture. You might recognise him from the podcast that me and Oliver do, which is Future X. Little plug if you don't. Please view it. He's an active ambassador for net zero futures and healthy buildings, and he was recognised as one of the construction sector's top 500 influencers in 2019 and as one of the UK's top 100 sustainable visionaries in 2021 by the UK Design Council. So let me welcome Dr. Oliver Jones.
Thanks, Martin. Hi, everyone. As Martin says, my role is in research and innovation. I'm very fortunate to have the oversight of what's going on in a number of different countries, and I really just want to talk to you today about some advanced materials, some changes and potential changes to business models, and the role that I think innovation can play in the future, and also what we're looking for in the next generation of materials and manufacturing within the supply chain moving forward. Part of my role is to work across a lot of accelerator and startup hubs. You get coming out of Berlin and New York and Sydney and indeed in the UK, find those businesses that really are on the cutting edge of doing something incredibly interesting with construction materials. They're quite frequently they're not bred from within the construction industry. They're chemists and biochemists and a wide range of other disciplines, and work with them and standards agencies to get their product into pilot projects and demonstrators, and then eventually get them into the mass market and large-scale production. So it kind of exists on a spectrum of innovation. At one end, we're working with blockwork developers, manufacturers and insulation manufacturers who are using waste products. And this is a real key theme that we're going to talk about here, and Duncan's definitely going to come on to talk about this, is the role that these manufacturers are playing, these advanced material manufacturers are playing in the circular economy and supporting that circular construction. So these guys are using waste plastics to produce carbon negative blockwork as we speak. They've already gone into production with it. They're using waste silica, typically from glass, but can also be rendered from other construction components to produce non-flammable, fire-safe insulation that's incredibly high-performing. That's all very comfortable. We're used to that as an industry. It's blocks, it's panels, it's insulation. At the other end, we've got some fantastic developments and innovations around biotech. We're looking at how you might be able to grow building components using mycelium, and there's some fantastic examples of that upstairs. How that can sequester twice its own weight in comparison to a phenolic panel that uses 3 times its own weight in carbon. A mycelic panel can sequester twice its own weight in carbon throughout when it's grown. It also has fantastic properties around acoustic, around structure, and around fire performance. So it's really exciting. But the thing that excites me most about this biospace is that it absolutely turbocharges our move towards a more circular economy. You know, mycelium is crazy. It will eat anything. It will eat plastics. So you can see that being a core part of how we start to recycle our products in the future and how we start to build and grow new building products out of those. We're working with the Deep Green Biotech Hub, and we've done a FutureX episode with those guys, so give it a listen, in Sydney. And they're using macroalgae and microalgae to clean the air that we breathe and to create high-value biomass that has already been proven to produce aviation-grade biofuel. It's already flown a plane using it. It's just struggling against the status quo to get scalability and funding. They've already produced a range of bioplastics, bricks. You may have seen, there was a recent Time magazine front cover that was about the future of algae and creating bricks and blocks using algae. So it's an incredibly exciting space. Things are moving very quickly. And at the same time, as an industry, as a sector, we're struggling with changing implications and disruptions from the digital area, from the fragility of our supply chain, and thinking about, well, how do we start to really safeguard and make that supply chain more resilient? Now, we came back from a really interesting trip around Germany, looking at the way that those guys are dealing with some of these new business models around the supply chain, and it really threw some key points out to me that I wanted to convey in this chat with you around what are we looking for in the next generation of materials, and what are we specifically looking to specify in the next generation of materials. And if you're familiar with the pathway to net zero, you know, you've got your stages A through to D, and as you get towards that D end, we're looking at reuse and recyclability. I feel like we're already making some fantastic progress in operational energy. You know, Gavin's talked a bit about that. We're starting to really get to grips with how we deal with embodied energy. Yes, it's got to work its way through, but we're getting there. But that reuse and recyclability piece, I think, offers manufacturers in the supply chain an unbelievable opportunity, because we turn the point of sale into, instead of being one point of sale, into a lifetime relationship with a client or with a homeowner. You know, Germany and the Netherlands are running take-back schemes on a lot of products. And then that's being planned into the resiliency of their supply chain. Those take-back schemes are already securing raw materials to safeguard that supply chain moving forward in terms of material shortages. So there's a huge opportunity, particularly as we learn in something around housing. Don't sell a house once when you can sell it 5 times by having a much better relationship, a lifetime relationship with the client or with the consumer. So there's a really interesting dynamic there and a shift in the way we think about supply chains and a shift in the way we think about manufacturing materials. One of the things that we're looking for and we're asking much more frequently now and really trying to get under the skin of is clearly, the embodied carbon that's in your products and in your materials. But we're starting to also take note of a wider range of things. So embodied social value is starting to get traction. Have you done calculations and measurements of the social impact of your manufacturing process, of where your raw materials come from? And the products that have this data, and we're all familiar with gathering and monitoring and measuring, we just need to focus on gathering and monitoring and measuring more around carbon and emissions and social impact. Because if you put that on the table in front of a group of people specifying, we're always going to take the path of least resistance. And if we've got that data to hand, it makes that job so much easier. So I think there's a huge change afoot. A lot of it is a potentially massive opportunity for elongating business models and looking not just 5 to 10 years in the future, but 25 to 50 years in the future about safeguarding your own material pipeline, whilst also measuring ongoing social impact and impact of reduction in carbon emissions. So I've covered quite a lot of ground there. I'll be around for the rest of the day anyway, just to answer some questions, and hopefully you guys can fire some questions at me at the end as well. But I'll not take any more time because I know there's plenty of people waiting to speak. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Oliver. So Oliver picked up on circularity quite a lot there, and so that leads quite nicely into my next guest, which is Chaline Church. She's the founding partner of 540 World. She's an interior architect specialising in circular materials and regenerative design specialist, and she enables social environmental wellness through the use of C2C certified materials to create non-toxic spaces for healthy futures. My pleasure to introduce Chaline Church.
So excuse me reading, but I've just finished with a bout of COVID a few days ago, so I'm negative, but I'm a bit brain foggy. So thank you for the opportunity, Martin, to discuss specifiers, and we're going to talk about a few best practices. So my name is Chaline, I'm from 540 World, and we are a circular design specialist company. We mostly work in infrastructure, particularly B2B. Our key consulting partner is the Environment Agency, and we do talk about cradle-to-cradle certified materials for most of the day. So let me just move on. So today there's a lot of scrutiny around certain siloed aspects of the environment, particularly CO2. And this siloed thinking leads to a focus on one area, like CO2 or reducing plastics or pesticides that kill bees, instead of crucial whole system planetary solutions, which is what we want to talk about today. So hopefully some of you have heard about planetary boundary science. If you haven't, please just look that up. There's loads of interesting information about that. But basically, we've now crossed 6 of 9 planetary boundaries. So we need specifiers to specify with regards to all the social environmental issues, and we've had some of the speakers allude to some of that today. It's no longer okay to specify just looking at costs or even just at carbon. So we need to specify in a much more robust, holistic way for the planet. A vital solution to support specifiers to push back on siloed thinking is the empowering of specifiers to embed multi-category thinking into their strategy. So along with costs and performance, we need to see socio-environmental categories as equally important. We need whole system, joined up, multi-category solutions based on planetary science and third-party verified data. So CO2 is not the most critical issue specifiers need to be considering. Example, the GOES report out of Edinburgh University, presented at COP26 by UK's Dr Howard Dryden, also well worth looking up, concluded that aquatic pollution is now the largest single threat to the planet. Specifically microplastics and chemical pollution, which falls under novel entities of the planetary boundary science. Basically, this will devastate the planet within the next 25 years, even if the world achieves net zero by 2045. And that's my last scary statistic of the day. So basically, we all need to support specifiers with verified case studies, data and knowledge sharing to fast track their ability to avoid greenwashing and engage with verified innovative products. And I mean evidence-based, third-party certified products and materials such as cradle-to-cradle certified products. Importantly, we've seen that the most successful international regenerative design case studies have fully engaged stakeholders from the beginning, from investors to clients, bankers, architects, designers, all the way through the chain, with contracts fully embedded with KPIs so the specifiers products do not drop off later due to costs. This can and is being done. For example, the Innovative Business Park in the Netherlands, Park 2020, also well worth looking up. So C2C certified is now the global standard for safe, circular and responsibly made products. This evidence-based multi-category approach to assess and certify products' material health, product circularity, clean air and climate protection, water and soil stewardship, and social fairness throughout a product supply chain for their certification, all third-party assessed and verified, supports 11 UN SDGs and all 9 planetary boundaries. It's basically a specifier's dream. So like the Environment Agency recently completed their due diligence in certificates and standards, and in 2021 in May included C2C certified materials as a minimum 25% monetary value in all of their contracts. So we're basically saying industry needs to be trained and fully enterprise future-proofed to include regenerative design throughout their structure, from purposes to networks, governance and ownership to finance, so throughout the enterprise. This photo is an environmental agency example. Here we helped specify Acquia, which is a acetylated, a modified natural wood. And this was to avoid specifying hardwoods for future fenders. They specified the sustainable softwood Acquia, which is also at it's a cradle-to-cradle certified example at gold level. So it's the highest multi-category sustainable wood you can find, basically. And this was done for the Thames estuary. So they used a multi-category approach, including biodiversity, water stewardship, material health, among others. And when we did the recent investigation, the Acquia one, which is the lighter wood in the middle, had achieved amazing biodiversity. I mean, it looked like a veritable jungle compared to all the other hardwoods with all their toxic coatings. And Acquia doesn't need any coating because the acetylation is a through process throughout the entire wood. It's changed at microbiological levels, so you don't need to have toxic coatings. So with lack of regenerative design regulation, or it's getting better, we're here, over 144 definitions of the circular economy, and the word sustainability not being a protected title, we need specifiers to push for highest design standards to engage with critical concept shifts for substantial change, from low-level compliance, and we spoke a bit about that earlier, thank you, and right up to through sustainable design, which is also fairly low level, right to the high-level regenerative design, which is really what we're saying we need to aim for. And this is not just a pie-in-the-sky hippie culture idea. This is actually to do with science. If we're going to meet planetary boundaries on time, we need to do it collaboratively, and we need to engage with regenerative design, which is basically cradle-to-cradle principles. So we need to engage upper management and all available structures and tools, including contracts, tenders, and KPIs to engage clients and the entire supply chain and stakeholders with regenerative design language, principles, and practice. All the lack of standardized, robust, multi-category regulation presents specifiers with a sea of confusion, lack of verified, equalized data, and lack of confidence in the product solutions presented, which tends towards reusing products from the past instead of engaging with innovations and best practice products. We need to arm specifiers with data to reduce the perceived higher cost argument, the lower performance argument, new supply chain or service risk arguments. Designing as nature with no pollution, no concept of waste, relying on natural energy and celebrating all diversity from flora to fauna, people to minerals must be supported with evidence-based data from the industry to drive change at pace. I'm just going to go into a couple of examples. This is the Venlo City Hall of 2016. They actually enhanced the air and climate quality, both inside and outside the building. They generate renewable energy without fossil fuel dependency. They created a material bank of healthy assessed materials that can perpetually flow in a biological or technical cycle. They enhance water quality by purifying and recycling water streams. And they also achieved a reduction to 4.7% of lost sick days from 6.2%. So if you know, operational costs are usually around 90% of the building, and I think it worked out to be about 3 million savings. So finally, we need to support specifiers with easy access to tools, including the UK C2C design directory, where you can actually find both related products and cradle-to-cradle certified products, the C2C Products Innovation Institute International Product Registry, and things like My Upcycler's digital library and blockchain like Materium. There's a lot of amazing tools out there. We really need to educate, train, and give access to specifiers to these tools. Also metrics, AI-enabled marketplace tools. For example, My Upcycler has a digital library, a digital middle section, which is about metrics, gives you all the residual values, including, and gives you either socio-environmental carbon, obviously carbon, etc., etc. And it also has an AI-enabled marketplace at the end module, which basically means you can find products and do urban mining in your local vicinity, and you can sell on your products in a local way as well. So what's possible? This is an example, just quickly, of the World Trade Center. So they've achieved 95% cradle-to-cradle certified materials in their offices. So it really is possible today. And I think we've got one more example. This is a recent example. This was just taken a couple of days ago. So this is the health clinic about 10 minutes up the way from here in London. It's the first cradle-to-cradle certified multi-materials retrofit, where everything was done in cradle-to-cradle certified, basically in the materials and in the operation. So even the Moser tiles used a cradle-to-cradle certified glue adhesive. So we've got Accoya wood in there, we've got graphenstone paint. So if you design in this way, for example, just if I look at graphenstone paint, 15 litres of graphenstone paint absorbs CO2 to the equivalent of a fully mature 250 kilogram tree. So that particular building is a veritable forest. So if we design cities like that, we actually have a really good chance of not only sorting out CO2, but also methane and all the other toxins, because all of these products, they don't have VOCs or toxins or carcinogens or any of the other toxic material off-gassing that a lot of other materials do. So hopefully that's inspired some of you to think about cradle-to-cradle certified and material banks for your next development.
Lovely, thank you, Chaline. So our last speaker today is Duncan Baker-Brown, and I've worked with Duncan for years. He's a really good friend of Futurebuild and EcoBuild, curating our waste zone over the years as well. Duncan is an architect, an academic, an environmental activist, and he's author of the Reuse Atlas, a designer's guide towards a circular economy, which was published by Reba. And sneak peek, get ready for version 2 coming out March next year. He's practiced research and taught issues of sustainable development and closed-loop systems for more than 25 years. So it's my absolute pleasure to have Duncan here today.
Thank you. Good morning. Brilliant to be here. What brilliant speakers. I feel like just absorbing everything you've just said and thinking about it rather than speaking. But I have too many slides. So I've got to get going, but you know, we are here. Can we afford to save ourselves? Are we all climate emergency deniers? I think we are. Okay, there's no vaccine, so why us? The construction sector consumes 50% of all raw materials mined and harvested every year. Oh, I'm going to have to stay Okay. So, 10 years ago, that was between 45 and 60 billion tonnes of stuff around the planet. It's now 100 billion tonnes of stuff. In the UK, we consume 600 million tonnes of products a year. We throw away 200 million tonnes of stuff, and 60% of that stuff is from the construction sector. That's 120 million tonnes of stuff a year we're throwing away. We're also, as a sector, pretty much responsible for 45% of carbon emissions, one way or another. We are in a hugely impactful sector. If you design a 10 metre by 10 metre concrete screed and you reduce the slab by 50 mil, you save more carbon than if you give up meat for a year. So in our business, we can do a lot of stuff, and we can turn linear systems into circular ones. So some good news. Everybody's talking about the reduction in consumption of stuff. These guys won the biggest prize in architecture last year with the strapline, never demolish, never replace. We've got campaigns to reduce VAT or make it equitable with new build on retrofit, and the campaign's got feet. Reuse is a big deal. People are sticking their hands to tarmac in the name of insulating our homes. It's yesterday's news, it's today's news, it's everyday's news. By the end of this year, a third of all households will be in fuel poverty. We're understanding about resources. This is my almost namesake, Duncan Baker MP, who put forward a 10-minute bill to Parliament, which basically encouraged the understanding, and I think Gavin mentioned it, of embodied carbon, whole life carbon, as well as operational carbon. In other words, building owners and developers will have to declare it. It's going to happen. 80% of today's built environment, of course, is with us, or will be with us in 2050. So that's the built environment that's got to meet net zero targets. So we've got to get our best architects and designers and suppliers involved with retrofit. We have to stop using new resources whenever possible. That is a photo montage of the amount of copper you get out of a hole that big. We've also got to close conventional mines. Anyone in the audience a miner? No. Who wants to be a miner? No. So we've got to mine the Anthropocene. We've got to rework the human-made layer of stuff that's in our oceans, our atmosphere, landfill sites, our cities, the stuff that's already got a carbon footprint, and invest in the biotechnologies and the organic materials that will replace the stuff that has no end-of-life strategy at the moment. We actually know what to do. There are countless reports out there giving us whole-life carbon descent plans to buy into. Building regulations aren't quite there, but that's been well stated before today already. We've got circular economy route maps that are now imposed in London this year. Part of the London plan, we've got one in Brighton and Hove where I'm from. We've got a good book as well that I wrote. Anyway, but that book was taking you on steps towards closed loop systems, with recycling being the most obvious basic thing to do. And I'm just wanting to point out, because from the point of view of terminology, recycling is profoundly different to reuse. Recycling is where you crush, shred, melt something, source material, and make it into something else. It has embodied carbon and waste and problems associated with it. It's the first basic step. But if you can reuse something, that's hugely better. If you can reduce the amount of stuff you use when you go about your normal job, whether that's designing a pen, a car, or a city, that's a really big deal. And obviously, cradle to cradle, closed loop systems are the way to go. And cities are our hope, because cities are our material stores for the future, and most people live in cities now. And we've got to be looking at urban mining, reworking the stuff we've already got. And urban mining might look like that. Adapting a Victorian building so it's reduced its carbon footprint by 80%. I'm just looking at this. This is a couple of dull slides, but this is how interested our clients are. This is 7 local authorities that have commissioned me to be in charge of a retrofit study looking at how to retrofit 45,000 social homes, how to do it with their maintenance budget. Where does their maintenance budget get them? They're mapping, we're mapping on 8 different house types, from bungalows to blocks of flats, material flows off the site, material flows onto site. What organic, natural materials can we be specifying? These are the questions the clients are asking, not me. We've done it before. This is from 2014. That's the Brighton Waste House. We constructed that with 360 students getting involved, builders, architects, designers. 90% of what you're looking at there is material other people threw away. We did it because at the time, for every 5 houses we were building, 1 house worth of waste went to landfill incineration. It's about every 6.5 houses now. We then decided to make it this sort of vessel, because it's on campus at the University of Brighton, this sort of vessel containing products without an end-of-life strategy. So, 25,000 toothbrushes that were collected in only 4 days from Gatwick Airport, as off the planes as they landed. So this is, if you think about it, this is oil processed into plastic, processed into toothbrushes, put on an airliner to arrive in Gatwick to be incinerated by the end of the week. That's a dumb design idea. So we've looked at other projects, like turning oyster shells into stuff, like concrete tiles. The white ones are 100% oyster shells. This is a brick which is not fired, it's hydraulically compacted. This is for the Design Museum in Ghent. It's made out of the earth on the site. The person that did the oyster shell tiles for us with the waste house is doing that in Ghent now. They're manufacturing 90,000 of these. So you can see the savings in carbon there, and that's the building. Rota, deconstruct buildings other people would demolish. So you read these slides top left to bottom right. Unpacking buildings, ugly buildings, big buildings, and redistributing that stuff into new building sites. They've got an online website. Other people are doing it. The Lendiger Group, or it's Lendiger Group from Denmark, cut up buildings that would normally be smashed up and make new buildings out of them. This is reuse. And they've got a spin-off company, which is called Again. And why I feature them and not Chaline's company is just because this is about a company born out of a need from the architects. The architects have not got the stuff they need yet. So we need companies like Chaline's, because Again is a company that finds waste and surplus material and then turns it into stuff that companies like Lendiger, who are a big architecture company, need. So these are waste resources turned into products. This is number 1 Triton Square, not far from here. That facade was 20 years old. That building is 20 years old. It still stands. It was going to be demolished. British Land deconstructed, sanctioned the deconstruction, careful deconstruction of the curtain wall system. It was unpacked, put in a car park nearby, cleaned up, upgraded, and put back up there. The only reason that could happen is because the suppliers still existed. And that's sort of the good thing about the financial districts around the world, where the buildings get stripped out every 5 years and rebuilt every 20 years, is the supply chain still there. The suppliers can help us turn linear systems into circular ones, and we won't do it without suppliers. Have I done with 10 minutes? Yeah. This is the last one. This is a building that was built 7 years ago. It was designed to be a material store. It was deconstructed this year. It is already reconstructed. And it looks like a normal building, because it is. So, I'm going to end on that. We need, and we're getting, the digital and physical infrastructure to allow for a circular economy. London has a circular economy route map, and there are feasibilities all across London at the moment looking at things like remanufacturers or circular economy construction hubs. These things that will facilitate deconstruction rather than demolition. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, that's fine, that's fine. Thank you, Duncan. I hope you all agree. I think today's presentations have been absolutely inspiring. We've probably got time for 3 or 4 questions, if anyone has any. Put your hand up and we'll come to you. Yes.
My microphone. Okay. One of the big challenges, I think, is that whilst all of these ambitions are fantastic, whilst we still have a quantity surveying sector who still have violent price points that don't reflect what we actually want to do, what the client wants to do, very few of these things will happen. Some projects do. The vast majority of people will be driven back towards a violent, more an incompetent one, because the prices were never right, the cost planning was always wrong. Do you see a solution?
Duncan, do you want to take that?
The cost plans are always wrong at the moment anyway, aren't they? I mean, without being flippant, there's some projects I'm working on where we know what materials, we know we've got the materials already because they're on site already. So we're not having to wait, they're not being delayed, so we can predict, they're predictable. So I think I think what we're offering is a more predictable, stable market actually. Especially again, if we get the suppliers involved. I mean, some of the projects I didn't get to show are where, you know, suppliers are actively engaged in the leasing of stuff rather than the selling of it. And the benefits of that in unstable markets, environments, I think more and more people are understanding right now. It's, you know, if we'd said this time last year, well, even though this time last year, we were getting tenders back, which were 50% over budget last summer. So we've had a year or two of it being completely unpredictable. I mean, I'd hate to be a QS at the moment. What's the point? Because, you know, you're just going to be beaten up, aren't you, as the tenders come back and it's overpriced. So we're in such a volatile environment. We've got to find ways where we're not relying on that linear system. And I think we have answers now.
Anyone else? Gavin, I've got a question for you. You mentioned.
Can I just come back on the other one?
Yeah, of course you can. Yes, absolutely.
One of the things I was going to say is all the examples you've seen here, these are buildings that add long-term value, right? There has to be business models that if you can create value, that we can make more money out of it as an industry and be a more interesting place to work as well. You know, this fixation on lowest capital cost at the point of completion is by no means best value. Even if you're looking at what we normally build using traditional technology, you can spend 2% more and get a building that's worth a lot more over a relatively short period of time. And that's before you even start to look at the really innovative stuff that really drives performance. So, you know, part of it's business models, but, you know, in any other sector, you go, oh, I can add value. Everybody's going, we can make money. Let's do things differently. This sector, maybe it's because we're so fragmented, maybe it's because we've got such traditional long procurement supply chains, we don't seem to grasp those opportunities, and it's deeply frustrating.
I actually want to speak into that as well. I think it was KPMG did a study for, I think it was JLL, where it might have even been for Park 2020, but it was one of the mixed-use resi developments, where they actually gave clients the choices of you can have this sort of linear economy template design, or you can have that one for, I think it was about 2,000 more. And they made a lot more money on those. Everybody went for the one that had the healthy interiors and all the materials that they knew what they were, and they had all the data, and they knew what their kitchen counter was made of, and they could reuse that and had residual value. They made more money. And this is a really, really classic commercial point. We need to help specify as an industry actually articulate those commercial benefits, because there are commercial benefits, and we're still using old models in Britain that are not commercially viable.
I think on that as well, we're at the risk of other people deciding the way that this game goes. So at the minute, there's an awful lot of incredible investment on ESG fronts from big funds going into this and pushing this a lot further than we're ready to take it at the moment. But another point is that it's around risk and mitigating risk. And we're in an environment now where we're collecting so much data on our cities. And a really good example of that is a lot of the stormwater modelling and flood modelling of our cities. We understand exactly where that water's going, where it needs to be stopped, how that will affect the site that's being developed. I think we're in an age, the Grenfell's been the watershed of it, where in 15, 20 years' time, if you build that building there and you've got the data to hand and you decide not to address the flood mitigation or the rainwater harvesting or the storm mitigation, then you'll be liable at some point down the road for that. Because we have it to hand right now, we're just choosing not to look at it in a large... and the same thing goes exactly as you said.
All the insurers will look at it.
Yes,
It's not
well, that's
anyway.
that's what'll drive it, I think, is insurance. Yeah. And insurers, as we've seen, you know, the price has gone through the roof. They'll be asking for, well, what's your plan for recyclability? What's your plan for this product at the end of its life? How much is this asset going to be worth over time? Or how much is this proportion of that asset going to be worth over time? So I think a large proportion of this will probably be driven by large investment funds and insurers if we don't take the lead.
You know what, just add in there, I'm from Easybed, we're on Futurebuild, but we're currently running a huge project on ESG as a company across our 5 sites in Paris, London, Milan, And we've got a huge push on ESG and we've signed a pledge to be net zero. And funny you mentioned JLL, they're our landlord in our London office, and we're monitoring exactly where we sit as our London office. And one of the options is that if the building isn't up to our standards to become net zero, we will move our offices. And as you say, if they haven't made the right choices, and the 80% of, the buildings, I think you said, that's the built environment we will have in 2050. If they haven't made the right choices in the building, when they retrofitted or when they built it, the consumer that buys and chooses where their lease is, we will move. We will move to the buildings that have made the right choices. So, it's a really important discussion among the companies to make when they're making these decisions, when they're looking at the cost book, when they're choosing their projects.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you're all architects, I've got one final question that I think you can all answer independently, and that's sort of how critical is it that manufacturers and architects work more closely together if we are to reach these goals? Oliver, do you want to take that one first?
I think it leads on from the conversation that I was talking about earlier, is that I think that the best of us are always looking for the next opportunity to be able to specify something that is going to tick those boxes around reduction in emissions, to be high performing material, and to also really, really importantly, and I keep banging on about this, but address the embodied social impact within the discussion around how that material's been manufactured, where the raw materials have come from. I think that's absolutely critical, and we're seeing it start to come in a lot more now. So there's a responsibility there, and there's also a growing level of knowledge within the industry as well to call out and to investigate and to probe embodied carbon and potential greenwashing of businesses, and just say, well, that doesn't stack up. Where are you getting your raw materials from? How does that work? What happens at the end of life? Because now I'm designing for disassembly. A lot of the things that Duncan's talked about.
Yeah. Gavin?
Oh gosh, lots of things whirling around my head, not least which conversation yesterday, which was about how do we get fire stops put in the right way up, even though they have big arrows on them saying which way up. So it gives you an idea of some of the granular, very practical challenges we deal with on a day-to-day. I think the opportunity for architecture is we've had probably 30 years where we've actually stopped designing buildings, I mean in their entirety. And actually, we know that if you spend just a little bit more time and actually design through the buildings, it unlocks all the things we've talked about today, whether it be simple things about performance gap. If you actually design something and think through where will the integration of the service in the fabric, simple things like all the way through to actually, do I really need to remove that wall, or can I reuse that building? A little bit more time spent on design actually unlocks a huge amount of value and a huge amount of improvement in performance on whichever metric you want. And that's what the design community has absolutely got to embrace. You mentioned Grenfell earlier as a watershed. There's so much coming out the back of that. New legislation coming through at the moment, which is going to create 30-year design liability for designers. Yeah? To me, that changes a lot. And if you're going to build something and you haven't thought through and you haven't designed it properly, how it's going to work, you're going to worry about that. You're going to see for the next 30 years whether that's going to come back to haunt you. Maybe it's a negative driver, but it might change things.
Chaline?
So yes, obviously I mentioned earlier about the planetary boundaries. They actually have looked at the science of it, and if we're not working collaboratively, and that's, I'm talking sort of on a big picture scale, right from government through to architects, to designers, specifiers, etc., we're not going to meet the targets that we need to meet. So we do have to do that. And yes, obviously, the countries that have worked collaboratively, especially the countries like the Netherlands and Germany and Belgium, they are in a much better space than we are, and that's because they've done a lot of international work and international case studies and collaborative work. And we are starting to do a little bit of that, but I mean, we had a meeting the other day where government presented a whole lot of work, and they just had failed to look at international case studies completely. And so we really need to be much more open-minded to absorb the best of the case studies and the best of what's out there. And that's right from granular examples right through, local granular examples right through to the Park 2020s. They are amazing solutions. We don't need to find solutions. We've actually got them. It's really just sharing those solutions quickly now.
Great. And Duncan?
Well, I'd echo everything that's just been said. And the last thing, I mean, that's why as a practicing architect, I'm not writing a book, which is just to go and look and find things that satisfy my ambitions for designing this way. I think we have got to reconnect with the supply chain as designers and deliver detailed design. And I think that's your point, is when we let go at it at REBA 3 or 4, that's been the problem. And I just think if you're a supplier and you're not, what's going to happen, is happening already, is that designers are asking a lot of the supply chain already. They're asking these questions, and if you can't satisfy those questions, we'll go somewhere else. Like we'll go to a building that's got a better energy rating because for whatever reason. So I just think you've got to be clued up with this, but we've got to re-engage with the supply chain. And with most of the examples I look at, they're only successful because everybody's got involved down to that granular level of the supply chain.
Brilliant. Thank you. So we're going to have some lunch and nibbles in a minute, and there's plenty of time to network. As Oliver said, the speakers will be around for a bit. Please do that. Also, the presentations will be on demand, so we'll be releasing those in the coming weeks. But I think what we can all take from today's presentations is that driving and improving sustainability in the built environment is a shared responsibility. But are we doing enough to decarbonise at the rate required? So, as the largest contributor, and Duncan mentioned this, of carbon emissions, almost 50%, the built environment can make the biggest impact in achieving that net zero. And it's a huge challenge, and we don't have that time to waste. Just this week, Lord Devon said, as part of the CCC report, that the government had willed the ends but not the means. And those committed to net zero in the built environment have been warning for some time that the targets are not enough, but action is now needed, and I think Gavin summed that up really well in his presentation. So the future is in our hands, and we must act now and take a stand, and that's why I want to introduce our campaign for Futurebuild 2023, which is we're taking a stand for that better built environment. So we are the industry's premier event, and we provide that stage, much like today, about inspiring ideas, showcasing those innovative solutions, and knowledge sharing to really drive sustainable construction and help us reach that goal of net zero. So we're taking a stand for the better built environment, and as an event from EcoBuild to now Futurebuild, we've been going for 17 years, and we've stood for many values that we believe will help play a part in creating that better built environment. And our values underpin what we stand for. And you've all got an envelope as you come in, and I'm not going to go into them in detail, but those values and our mission for 2023 is outlined in there. But we really want to showcase the best products, the best materials, and support innovation. We're long-term champions of sustainability. If you've been coming to the show from 2004, 2005, you'll know, year in, year out, we've been championing a more sustainable built environment. We enable collaboration. We bring together the leading specifiers to really make a difference. And we deliver independent curated content, and that's really what's at the heart of our event. We're influential, and most importantly, we walk the talk. As Lorda just said there, as a company now we're looking at ESG, we will be implementing huge amounts of sustainability initiatives to make our event net zero in the coming years too. The venue, Excel, is already on the way of being the net zero venue. So I want to ask you all what you're going to take a stand for. Because we believe through product innovation and manufacturing, the appropriate use of technologies and good design and delivery, we can build a better future. And we also believe that you and everyone within the supply chain has got a solution that can really drive a positive change. So our question, therefore, is what will you take a stand for? What will you commit to help create a better industry and meet the challenges that must be dealt with now? Now, they always say there's no such thing as a free lunch, and I am going to let you all leave in a minute and have a lunch, but I've got a favour to ask. You've seen we've got a big banner up there. If you're feeling brave, I'd love you just to do a quick vox pop interview about what you're really passionate about, what you want to take a stand for to make a better built environment. And if you want to find any more information out about Futurebuild, we've got a whole Futurebuild team here as well. So it just leaves me to say thank you very much for attending. I hope you found the presentations as inspiring as I do. Massive thanks again to our speakers. And yeah, go and network. Thank you.